Is this a joke? The girl's laughter erupted in the middle of the luxury restaurant, drawing every eye in the room. Daniel Hayes sat perfectly still, his simple, modest clothes making him look like a ghost in a palace of gold. She shook her head, stating bluntly that she would never date someone like him. Nearby tables began to whisper, turning the moment into public humiliation. She stood up and walked out without looking back. But as the door opened, her father stepped in. He froze, looked at Daniel, stood at attention, and saluted. The entire restaurant went dead silent. Daniel Hayes was 36 years old, but his hands looked as though they had lived a century of heavy labor. They were calloused, steady, and clean, despite the high-stakes industrial maintenance work he performed every day. Daniel was a single father. His entire universe revolved around his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. They lived in a modest, neatly kept house on the outskirts of the city, a place filled with stacks of books, unfinished science projects, and a deep, quiet love that didn't need words to be understood. Daniel worked as a senior systems maintenance technician for a global logistics conglomerate. It was a role that required extreme technical precision, an analytical mind, and a level of calm that most people couldn't maintain in a crisis. He was the man they called at 3 a.m. when the massive automated grids failed. He was the one who could find a needle-thin fracture in a mile of steel pipe just by listening to the vibration. He was respected by his fellow technicians for his work ethic and his brilliance. But Daniel never sought the spotlight. He preferred the shadows. He preferred the peace of a Saturday afternoon spent helping Sophie build a model rocket or a telescope in their backyard. What very few people in his civilian life knew was that Daniel's technical mastery didn't begin in a local workshop. 16 years ago, he had been a highly specialized operator in the military. He worked in high-stakes technical safety systems, responsible for the integrity of equipment that protected hundreds of soldiers in active combat zones. He had served with absolute distinction, earning the respect of generals and privates alike. However, he had left the service early following a catastrophic event, a secret mission that had cost him his team and nearly his life. He never spoke of that night. He buried the trauma under a layer of quiet routine and fatherhood. Since his wife, Elena, had passed away 6 years ago after a sudden illness, Daniel had effectively closed the door on his own personal life. He had become a living shield for Sophie, absorbing every blow the world tried to land on them. He was a father first, a technician second, and a man last. He wore simple, off-brand jeans and flannel shirts. He drove a 12-year-old truck that he maintained to run like a luxury sedan, and he didn't care for the designer names or the empty social status that seemed to obsess the city around him. He felt like a traveler from another time, watching a world that valued the wrapper more than the gift. Sophie, however, was growing older and more observant. She began to notice the quiet, lingering loneliness in her father's eyes when he thought she was asleep. She saw him looking at old photos of her mother with a mixture of love and longing. With the help of Daniel's best friend and former squad mate, Mike, Sophie convinced her father that it was time to try and move forward. "You're a hero, Dad," she had told him while they were eating pizza one night. "You deserve to have someone look at you the way Mom did. You deserve to be happy too." Reluctantly, and mostly to stop Sophie from worrying, Daniel agreed to a blind date. Mike had set it up with a woman named Clara, the daughter of a prominent local figure. Mike had promised that Clara was someone grounded and real, looking for a man with substance. On the evening of the date, Daniel spent an hour making sure Sophie was settled with her favorite babysitter. He dressed in his best clothes, which were still incredibly modest compared to the high fashion standards of the city's elite. He chose a clean, dark navy polo and well-fitted chinos. To him, he looked respectful and prepared. To the world he was about to enter, he looked like a common laborer who had wandered into the wrong building. The venue was the Gilded Lily, a restaurant where the menus didn't have prices and the waitstaff moved like silent shadows. Daniel arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from his military days. He chose a table in a quiet corner, away from the glittering center of the room. He didn't order an expensive, flashy cocktail. He sat with a simple glass of water, watching the room with the practiced, scanning gaze of a man who had once guarded perimeters in hostile territory. He felt deeply out of place among the silk ties and diamond necklaces, but he remained calm. He wasn't there to impress a room full of strangers with his bank account. He was there to honor a promise to his daughter. He had no idea that the woman walking through the door was about to challenge every ounce of his discipline. He didn't know that the ghosts of his military past were waiting in the lobby, ready to reemerge in a way that would change his life forever. Daniel Hayes was just a dad looking for a fresh start, but the universe was preparing a reckoning. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Clara arrived 20 minutes late, making a grand theatrical entrance that ensured every head in the restaurant turned to watch her. She was undeniably beautiful, dressed in a designer silk dress that cost more than Daniel's truck, and she carried an air of effortless, unearned superiority. She looked around the room with a practiced, judgmental squint, finally spotting Daniel in his quiet corner. As she approached the table, her polite smile began to vanish, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. She didn't see a man of character. She saw a man whose watch was made of rubber and whose shoes were designed for durability rather than the red carpet. She sat down, not with a greeting, but with a heavy sigh of disappointment that could be heard 3 tables away. From the very first minute, Clara turned the date into a technical interrogation. She didn't ask about Daniel's passions, his dreams, or his daughter. She asked about his zip code. She asked about the make and model of his car. She asked about his country club membership. When she finally asked what he did for a living, Daniel replied with his usual blunt honesty, "I maintain logistics systems. I make sure the complex grids that move the world's goods keep humming behind the scenes." Clara smirked, a sharp, cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. "So you're a repairman, a janitor for machines?" Daniel didn't flinch. He had been called worse things by men holding rifles in the middle of a desert. "I'm a systems technician, Clara. It's honest, difficult work, and it provides a good, safe life for my daughter." The mention of being a single father seemed to be the final straw for Clara. She leaned back in her velvet chair, her eyes scanning the restaurant with embarrassment, clearly horrified to be seen with him. The people at the neighboring tables, wealthy socialites, young tech heirs, and local influencers, began to notice the tension. They whispered behind their silk napkins, their eyes darting toward Daniel's simple attire with a mix of pity and amusement. Clara began to use small, biting insults. She talked at length about her recent trip to Milan and the caliber of men she usually encountered in those circles. She made sure to mention, loudly enough for the waitstaff to hear, that her father was a highly decorated retired general who only associated with men of global significance. She was trying to make Daniel feel small, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify her own shallow arrogance. Daniel remained a pillar of unyielding stone. He listened to her rants with a calm, observant silence. He saw the deep-seated insecurity hiding behind her vanity. He saw a woman who was terrified of being seen as ordinary. But the environment in the restaurant was becoming increasingly hostile toward him. The head waiter lingered nearby, his expression suggesting that Daniel was bringing down the aesthetic of the high-end establishment. Finally, Clara reached her breaking point. Daniel had refused to be intimidated by her wealth or her words, and his quiet dignity made her feel transparent. She let out a loud, mocking laugh, the kind of laugh that demands an audience to validate it. "Is this a joke?" she shouted, loud enough for the entire room to fall silent. "Mike told me you were someone special, but you're just a guy who fixes things in a warehouse. I don't date the help, Daniel. I don't date men who have grease under their fingernails and no ambition beyond a 2-car garage in the suburbs." The restaurant went dead quiet. The humiliation was public and brutal. The socialites at the next table snickered openly, one even pulling out a phone to record the scene. Clara stood up, grabbing her expensive designer clutch with a flourish. "Don't bother calling me. I think we both know you don't belong in a place like this. You should have stayed in the garage where people like you are comfortable." She turned and marched toward the door, her heels clicking like gunshots on the polished marble floor. Daniel didn't follow her. He didn't shout back. He didn't even look angry. He simply picked up his glass of water and took a steady sip. He was thinking of Sophie. He was thinking of the lesson he had taught her since she was 5 years old. Never let someone else's opinion of you become your reality. The air in the room was thick with a mixture of pity and mockery. Clara was nearly at the exit, her head held high in a fake, hollow triumph. She thought she had won. But then the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Lily swung open with a purposeful force. A man walked in. He was older, with steel gray hair and a posture that could only belong to a lifetime of absolute command. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, but he carried himself like he was still wearing a suit of armor. Every staff member in the room immediately stood a little straighter. It was Clara's father, General Harrison Reed. Clara's face lit up with a look of relief. She hurried toward him, her voice already rising to complain about the disastrous man she had just encountered. "Father, you won't believe the person Mike tried to set me up with. He's a nobody, a laborer who—" But General Reed wasn't looking at his daughter. He wasn't looking at the hostess or the manager. His eyes were locked on a man sitting alone in a corner booth, holding a glass of water. The general froze. His face went pale, then flushed with a deep, primal emotion. He brushed past Clara as if she were a ghost in the hallway, his eyes never leaving Daniel Hayes. "Have you ever been judged unfairly? Comment respect if you understand." General Reed walked across the restaurant floor with a speed and intensity that silenced the room. He didn't walk, he marched. The arrogance and the whispers of the room seemed to evaporate in his wake. He reached Daniel's table and stopped abruptly. To the absolute shock of every person in the Gilded Lily, the most powerful and feared man in the city snapped his heels together and stood at a rigid, perfect attention. Then he raised his hand to his brow in a slow, reverent, and deeply meaningful military salute. "Commander Hayes," the general said, his voice booming with a mixture of authority and profound, heartbreaking gratitude. Daniel Hayes set his glass down. He stood up slowly, his movements fluid, precise, and devoid of the laborer persona Clara had imagined. He returned the salute, not as a repairman, but as a brother in arms who had shared the same trench. "It's been a long time, General," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying through the silent room. The entire restaurant was paralyzed. Clara stood by the door, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of confusion. The socialites who had been laughing moments ago were now frozen in a state of mounting shame. They didn't understand the history, but they understood the weight of the moment. General Reed stepped forward and took Daniel's hand, shaking it with both of his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd see you again, Daniel. Not after you walked away from the Medal of Honor ceremony. I spent 3 long years looking for you just to say thank you properly." The general turned to the room, his eyes scanning the crowd like a tactical searchlight. He saw the judgmental looks. He saw his daughter's stunned and pale face. He spoke to the entire restaurant, but his words were aimed directly at Clara's soul. "You all see a man in simple clothes," the general barked, his voice echoing against the gold-leafed ceilings. "But you are looking at the man who saved my entire battalion 15 years ago. We were trapped in a technical blackout in a hostile valley in the middle of a winter storm. Our systems were fried, our communications were dead, and we were being surrounded by a force that doubled ours." The general's voice softened, but the intensity remained. Daniel Hayes was the lead technical engineer for the Special Ops Unit. He stayed behind in a burning communications hub to manual patch the satellite link. He was wounded by shrapnel, the building was literally collapsing around him, and every officer on the field told him to run for the extraction. But he didn't, he refused. He stayed until the signal went through. He stayed until the air support arrived. He dragged me out of a destroyed command vehicle while the fuel lines were exploding. And when we were all safe in the hospital, he just disappeared. He didn't want the medals, he didn't want the parade or the news cameras. He wanted his peace. Daniel looked down at the table, his expression humble. "I just wanted to go home to my family, General. The mission was over." "The mission was impossible, Daniel," the general countered, "but you did it anyway. And then you walked away from the glory because you didn't think you were a hero. You thought you were just doing your job." Clara walked slowly back toward the table, her face a mask of absolute horror. She realized she had just publicly insulted a man her father considered a living god. She realized the grease under his fingernails was the reason her father was still breathing today. "Father, I had no idea," Clara whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely speak. The general turned to her, his gaze filled with a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. That is the ultimate problem with your world, Clara. You look for the glitter, but you ignore the gold. You looked at this man and saw a repairman. I look at this man and see the finest soldier and the most brilliant engineer I ever had the honor to command. You should be kneeling in gratitude for his presence, not walking out in laughter. You have embarrassed this family in a way I cannot describe. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted from a toxic playground of the elite into a place of profound, stinging respect. The socialites at the next table were staring at their plates in silence. The head waiter, who had been ready to ask Daniel to leave, now bowed his head as he passed. Daniel looked at Clara. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet, weary wisdom. He saw her shame, but he didn't revel in it. He wasn't a man who needed to win a social argument. He had already won the only thing that mattered to him, his own peace of mind and the love of his daughter. He realized that Sophie had been right. It was time for him to stop hiding in the shadows. But he didn't need a general salute to know who he was. He had known it the entire time. CTA, do actions matter more than status? Tell us your thoughts below. General Trade insisted on sitting with Daniel. He dismissed the waitstaff's frantic attempts to move them to a better or more exclusive table, stating clearly that any table Daniel Hayes sat at was already the most important table in the city. Clara sat down as well, but she couldn't bring herself to look Daniel in the eye. She felt the weight of her own shallow judgment pressing down on her arm. The dinner continued, but the conversation was fundamentally different now. The general spoke of the old days, of the technical brilliance Daniel had shown under extreme pressure. He spoke of how the military had struggled for a decade to find anyone who could match Daniel's intuitive understanding of complex failing systems. Daniel listened, offering only small, humble details when asked. Finally, Clara spoke. Her voice was small, stripped of all its previous arrogance. Daniel, I am so incredibly sorry. I was blind. I was foolish. I judged you based on a world of appearances that doesn't actually matter. I was trying to impress people who don't even know me, and in the process I insulted a man of true honor. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how wrong I was. Daniel looked at her for a long time. He saw the genuine regret in her eyes. He reached across the white tablecloth and placed a calloused, steady hand on hers, not as a romantic gesture, but as a gesture of simple human forgiveness. It's okay, Clara, Daniel said. We live in a world that is designed to teach us to value the wrapper more than the gift inside. I'm not angry. I just hope that tomorrow, when you look at the person who fixes your car, maintains your building, or delivers your packages, you look at them a little differently. Every one of them has a story, and some of those stories are worth more than any designer dress or luxury car. Clara nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The general smiled, proud of the man Daniel had become in the years since the war. The other diners in the restaurant watched the interaction with a new perspective. They had witnessed a live lesson in humility that no amount of money could buy. As the night drew to a close, the general offered Daniel a high-level executive position at his new international security firm, a role that came with a massive salary and global influence. Daniel thanked him but shook his head with a gentle smile. I appreciate the offer, General. Truly. But I like my life. I like being able to pick Sophie up from school without my phone ringing every 5 minutes. I'm a technician, but more importantly, I'm a dad. That's the only rank and the only title I need for the rest of my life. The general stood up and shook Daniel's hand one last time, his grip firm. You always were the smartest of us, Daniel. You knew when the mission was truly over and the real life began. Clara walked Daniel to his old truck in the valet line. The Ferraris and Lamborghinis were still lined up, but they didn't seem so imposing to her anymore. Clara looked at Daniel's worn, reliable truck and smiled. It's a good truck, Daniel. It looks like it's seen some miles. Daniel chuckled, climbing in. It's reliable. That's all that matters in the end. Would you admit your mistake publicly? Comment yes or no. A few days after the blind date, Clara contacted Daniel again. She didn't ask for another date. She asked if she could bring a small gift for Sophie as a token of her apology. They met at a public park. a neutral and open space far from the suffocating judgment of high-end restaurants. As they were walking toward the playground where Sophie was playing, a sudden sharp commotion broke out in the far corner of the parking lot. A group of rowdy young men were harassing an elderly woman, trying to snatch her bag. The air grew sharp with tension. Clara looked worried, her first instinct being to reach for her phone to call for help. Daniel didn't panic. He moved with a practiced, terrifyingly calm efficiency that Clara had only seen in movies. He handed his truck keys to Clara and stepped toward the group. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood in their path, his feet shoulder-width apart, his eyes scanning the threats with a cold, tactical precision. The young men laughed at first, seeing only a middle-aged man in a work jacket, but as they got closer, they saw his eyes. They saw the absolute, bone-chilling lack of fear. They saw the posture of a predator who had seen much worse than them. Daniel spoke one single sentence. "That's enough. Leave the lady alone and walk away while you still have the chance." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty of his command, shattered their bravado instantly. They looked at each other, saw the steel in Daniel's frame, and realized they were in way over their heads. They dropped the bag, scrambled into their car, and sped away. Clara watched in absolute awe. She realized that Daniel's strength wasn't something he put on for show. It was woven into the very fabric of who he was. Whether he was fixing a complex machine, sitting in a luxury restaurant, or standing in a park, he was a protector. As they walked back to Sophie, who was happily playing on the swings, Clara realized that a real man isn't defined by his bank account, his title, or his social circle. A real man is defined by what he does when the world gets dark and people are in need. Sophie ran up to them, hugging Daniel's waist. "Did you fix something again, Dad?" Daniel smiled, picking her up and ruffling her hair. "Just keeping our world a little bit safer, sweetie, that's all." Clara looked at them both and felt a profound sense of peace. She had lost a blind date, but she had gained a perspective that would change the way she looked at every human being she met for the rest of her life. She realized that the people who maintain the world's infrastructure are the ones who carry the world's weight. True value is never found on a price tag, a business card, or a designer label. We live in a society that is obsessed with the aesthetic of success, often forgetting the substance of character. Daniel Hayes reminds us that the people who maintain our world, the technicians, the drivers, the laborers, are often the ones who have sacrificed the most to keep it turning. Respect is not something you give to someone because of their social status. It is something you owe to every human being who carries themselves with integrity. Don't be like Clara at the beginning of the night. Don't let your eyes be blinded by the surface. Look deeper. You might find a hero sitting right in front of you, disguised as an ordinary man. If you believe real strength comes from character and not status, comment respect below. And don't forget to subscribe to Iron Dad Stories for more powerful, true, and inspiring stories about the everyday heroes who walk among us. Thank you for watching.